It was just another normal day for Maya. She had finished work and was heading home, eager to kick back and relax after a long day. Maya worked as a data analyst for a company downtown. She loved her job, and though it could sometimes be stressful, it was a good feeling to know she was helping people with her skills. Maya was always professional, calm and collected, and she liked to think of herself as someone who could handle almost any situation with a cool head. She was driving through the streets of the city, the sun starting to set behind the tall buildings, as she made her way through the traffic. The cars were moving slowly, and Maya enjoyed the peacefulness of the drive. The radio played softly, and she hummed along to a song she liked. She looked out of the window at the passing streetlights, thinking about what to make for dinner when she got home. Everything felt so ordinary, so peaceful. Little did she know her day was about to take an unexpected turn. As Maya approached a stoplight, she noticed two police cars parked on the side of the road. One of them had its lights flashing, but it wasn't responding to an emergency. It was just sitting there. Maya didn't think much of it at first, but as she slowly passed them, one of the officers in the car waved her down, signaling her to pull over. Her heart skipped a beat. Why was she being stopped? She wasn't speeding, and she hadn't run a red light. She followed the officer's instructions and pulled her car over to the side of the road, feeling a little nervous, but not sure why. First officer approached her window. He was tall and had a serious look on his face. He knocked gently on the glass with his knuckles, and Maya lowered the window. "Good evening, ma'am," the officer said, his voice low and stern. Maya smiled politely and responded, "Good evening, officer. Is there a problem?" She tried to keep her tone respectful but was already feeling a little uneasy. The officer didn't seem to answer her question right away. Instead, he just stared at her for a moment before speaking. "Do you know why I stopped you, ma'am?" he asked, his eyes narrowing as he looked over her. Maya felt the sudden change in atmosphere, like something was off. There wasn't a real reason for her to be pulled over, but the officer was acting like she'd done something wrong. "No, officer, I don't." "Was I speeding?" Maya asked, trying to stay calm. The officer didn't answer right away. Instead, he just shook his head slowly, like he was disappointed by her response. "No, you weren't speeding," he said in a quiet voice, "but your taillight is out." He pointed to the back of her car. Maya glanced over her shoulder at the rear lights, but nothing seemed to be wrong. She knew for sure the taillight had been working just the day before. "Are you sure, officer?" "I checked it recently and it seemed fine," Maya said, trying to stay composed. The officer's eyes softened slightly, but his expression was still distant, like he was looking for a reason to give her a hard time. He didn't respond right away, but instead leaned in a little closer to her window, almost as if inspecting her. "Step out of the car, please," the officer said, his voice now firmer, almost commanding. Maya hesitated for a moment, wondering why she was being asked to get out. It wasn't a serious issue, just a tail light after all, but something in the officer's tone made her feel uneasy. Still, Maya did as she was told. She opened the door and stepped out of the car, feeling the cool evening air hit her face. The second officer, who had been standing by the other police car, now walked over to join them. He was shorter but built more solidly. He gave her a quick once-over, his eyes scanning her from head to toe. Both officers stood there for a few moments without saying anything, just eyeing her. It felt like they were trying to figure her out, almost sizing her up. Maya stood still, her arms folded, trying not to show how uncomfortable she felt. It was becoming more and more clear to her that something wasn't right. The interaction was no longer just about a tail light. The first officer finally broke the silence. "I'm going to need to check your ID and registration, ma'am," he said, his voice still a little stiff. Maya nodded, pulling out her wallet and retrieving her driver's license. She handed it over without a word, trying to remain calm. The second officer took a step forward, now looking at her with a little more suspicion. "Is this your car?" he asked, eyeing her closely. Maya nodded again. "Yes, it's mine," she said, keeping her tone even. The officers didn't respond right away. They just stood there looking at her like they were waiting for her to say something more. Maya knew what was happening. She could feel it. These officers weren't stopping her because of a taillight. They had stopped her for something else, something much less innocent. The officers exchanged a quick look, and then the first one glanced down at his clipboard, scribbling something down. Maya waited, feeling the weight of the silence between them. As the seconds ticked by, the officer's body language began to shift. The second officer stepped closer to her, and for the first time, Maya felt his gaze linger a little too long. It was uncomfortable, to say the least. He didn't seem to be concerned with her ID or the car's registration anymore. Instead, he seemed more interested in her appearance. Maya felt a sudden chill run down her spine. Finally, the first officer spoke again. "You know, it's really hot out tonight," he said, almost like he was trying to make small talk. "And with your skirt? Well, it's kind of, breezy, isn't it?" His tone was too casual, like he was making some kind of joke, but Maya didn't find it funny. In fact, she found it inappropriate. She tried not to react, but it was hard to ignore. She kept her gaze fixed on the officer, not wanting to let him see how much his words had bothered her. The second officer grinned at the comment. Without warning, he stepped forward and tugged on the hem of Maya's skirt, pulling it just a little higher. It wasn't a hard tug, but it was enough to make her feel humiliated. Maya's heart skipped a beat, and for a split second, everything inside her seemed to freeze. She couldn't believe what had just happened. It felt like an invasion, an embarrassing and unnecessary act meant to make her feel small. Maya, however, was no stranger to such moments. She had dealt with people who thought they could get away with treating her differently because of her race, her gender, or both. But this felt like something deeper, something uglier. Maya's mind raced as the officer's hand tugged at the hem of her skirt. It was a quick motion, but the impact was immediate. The pull felt like a slap to her dignity, a reminder that she, like many other black people, had sometimes been reduced to something less than human in the eyes of those in power. She could feel the heat rise in her cheeks as a rush of anger mixed with humiliation, but she didn't let herself react right away. She knew from experience that losing her cool wasn't going to help. Instead, Maya held her breath and tightened her grip on her composure. For a few seconds, she stood there trying to assess what had just happened, and wondering whether this was really happening. The officers' behavior, the way they had laughed, among themselves made her feel like they were mocking her in the most cruel way possible. They were laughing as if she was just a joke. But to Maya, it wasn't funny. It wasn't funny at all. The second officer who had tugged at her skirt grinned, his eyes moving from her to the other officer, as if they were in on a shared secret. They weren't laughing out loud anymore, but their body language told her that they didn't see what they had done as wrong. Maya stood there, frozen for a moment, as a sense of disbelief washed over her. She wasn't sure if it was the shock of the moment or her own growing anger, but something inside her clicked. She wasn't about to let this slide. She had faced injustice before, but there was something about the way these officers were treating her that pushed her past the point of tolerance. She could feel herself beginning to take control of the situation, though the storm of emotions swirled inside her. She wasn't sure what exactly to do next, but she had to do something. Maya glanced over at the first officer, who seemed to be waiting for her to say something. His expression had softened just a bit since the tug on her skirt, but it wasn't out of concern. It was more like he was watching her, waiting to see how she would react. The second officer, still smirking, took a step back and leaned against the side of the car. Maya could hear the sound of her own heartbeat in her ears, but she didn't let it distract her. She wasn't going to let them see how rattled she felt. No matter how humiliating the situation was, she was determined not to let them get the best of her. Then, in that moment of quiet, Maya made a decision. She needed to regain control. She needed to turn the tables. "I work for the FBI," Maya said, her voice calm and steady as she looked directly at the first officer. The words fell out of her mouth without hesitation, though inside she could feel her pulse quicken. She wasn't bluffing. In fact, She wasn't even thinking about bluffing. She knew that saying this would catch the officers off guard and, more importantly, it would remind them of the power they were so casually abusing. For a moment, there was silence. The second officer, who had been leaning against the car, straightened up. His eyes widened, and his smirk faded. Maya could see the change in his body language almost immediately. He hadn't expected that. The first officer blinked, looking at her with a mixture of surprise and uncertainty. Maya didn't back down. She kept her stance firm, meeting their gaze without flinching. She could tell they were trying to process what she had just said. The words FBI hung in the air between them like a heavy weight. They both knew what that meant. The moment the words left her mouth, the mood shifted completely. The second officer looked at the first one for a second, his eyes darting nervously as if trying to figure out how to handle the situation. He took a step back, and the tension in the air grew thicker. Maya, who had been struggling to keep her emotions in check just moments ago, now felt a surge of power. She had taken control of the situation with a single sentence. It wasn't a lie. She wasn't some random woman they could laugh at and belittle anymore. She had just reminded them that they were not the ones in charge. The first officer cleared, his throat still looking at Maya as though trying to decide what to do next. He glanced down at his clipboard again, as if the answer to his next move was somewhere on the paper. But there was no answer there, no easy way out. He couldn't just brush her off now, not after that statement. Maya stood tall, watching them, closely, waiting for them to figure it out. She could feel the shift in their energy, a slight unease that hadn't been there just moments ago. The second officer, who had initially seemed so confident, now seemed a little nervous. He took a few steps back, not wanting to stand too close to her. The first officer, still trying to act in control, began to fumble with his radio as if he needed to double-check something. His movements became quicker, more frantic. The casual confidence that had filled the air earlier was gone, replaced by uncertainty. For a moment, Maya just stood there watching them as they tried to regain their composure. The officers weren't laughing anymore. They weren't making jokes. The power dynamics had shifted, and it wasn't in their favor anymore. Maya didn't need to say anything else. Her calm, confident response had done exactly what she intended. It had shaken them, made them realize that they weren't in charge here. She could see it in their eyes. The realization that they might have just made a big mistake. The first officer quickly turned away from Maya and began talking into his radio. The second officer shifted on his feet, clearly trying to find an excuse to leave. They weren't sure how to handle the situation now that Maya had revealed that she worked for the FBI. It was as if her calm authority had broken through the wall they had built up around themselves. Maya remained silent, watching them, but on the inside, she was starting to feel a sense of empowerment. She had taken control of the situation without raising her voice, without losing her temper. She had made it clear that she wasn't someone to be messed with, and the officers knew it. They could no longer hide behind their jokes or their superiority. They were now the ones on the back foot. Finally, after a few more moments of awkward silence, the first officer spoke again. His tone was different now, less condescending, more cautious. "I apologize, ma'am," he said, his voice lacking the certainty it had earlier. "We'll take care of this right away." He glanced over at the second officer, who nodded stiffly. Neither of them seemed eager to continue the conversation. Maya didn't reply right away. She simply gave a small nod, still standing tall and composed. She wasn't interested in hearing their half-hearted apologies. They hadn't earned her forgiveness just yet. What mattered now was that she had turned the situation around. She had taken her power back, and that felt better than any apology could. The seconds that followed Maya's calm statement hung in the air like a heavy weight. Everything felt suspended for a moment, almost as if time had stopped. The two officers, once so sure of themselves, now appeared completely thrown off balance. Their stiff postures and nervous glances between each other told Maya everything she needed to know. She had caught them off guard, and it was clear that they didn't know how to handle the situation anymore. She could hear the sounds of their radio crackling in the background, the voices of other officers mumbling through the static. Maya stood still, feeling a strange sense of power that she hadn't anticipated. It was as if she had suddenly found the missing piece to a puzzle she had been trying to solve for years. All her experiences, every moment of injustice she had faced, every time she had felt powerless, had led her to this one moment where she could stand her ground. She wasn't just a black woman being mistreated anymore. She was someone who had control of the narrative. She was no longer the target. She was the one holding the power. The officers continued to look at each other, unsure of what to do next. The second officer, who had earlier been so quick to laugh, now seemed to be shrinking back. He wasn't smirking anymore, and his face had lost the confident expression it had worn when they had first approached Maya. His eyes darted nervously from the first officer to Maya, and then back again, as if he were hoping someone else would take charge. The first officer, who had been the one to initially approach her, was fumbling with his radio, speaking into it in short, quick sentences. Maya couldn't hear the words clearly, but she could tell that he was trying to call for backup, or perhaps explain what had just happened. For a brief moment, Maya considered saying something else, pushing further. She knew how easy it would be to call out their behavior, to ask for their badge numbers or demand that they admit their wrongs. But instead of lashing out, she decided to stay calm. She had already taken control. What else was there to do but let them stew in the consequences of their actions? She wasn't going to make it easy for them. As the radio crackled and the officers continued to talk to each other, Maya's mind wandered for a moment. She thought about the countless times she had heard stories from other black women, other people of color, who had faced similar mistreatment from law enforcement. There were always stories of wrongful stops, of inappropriate comments, of power being abused in ways that left people feeling small and helpless. But Maya wasn't helpless. She had learned how to stand up for herself, how to handle these situations with a clear head. Her thoughts turned to her career. She had worked hard to get where she was, to build her life, and to prove that she wasn't just another statistic. She had worked in a fast-paced world where there was little room for error, and that had made her resilient. It had also made her determined to never let anyone make her feel less than she was. She thought about how her calm demeanor had shifted the power dynamic just now. It wasn't a fluke. It was the result of years of building strength from within. Maya wasn't just another black woman. She was Maya, and she had earned the right to be treated with respect. The silence stretched on. The officers were still whispering into the radio, and Maya stood firm, her arms folded across her chest, her gaze unwavering. She could feel the eyes of the officers on her, but she didn't look away. She wasn't going to give them the satisfaction of seeing her nervous or scared. Instead, she stood tall, and she held her ground with an air of quiet authority. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, the first officer turned back to her. His eyes were still filled with unease, but he seemed to have regained some of his composure. He cleared his throat and spoke slowly, his voice lower than before. "Ma'am, we apologize for the inconvenience," he said, though there was no real warmth in his words. "We'll let you go with just a warning this time." Maya nodded, but her expression remained unchanged. She wasn't interested in their apology. She wasn't interested in their half-hearted attempt to smooth things over. What mattered now was the power shift that had taken place. Maya had made them uncomfortable, and that was exactly what she wanted. They couldn't just continue with their disrespect, with their inappropriate behavior. They were forced to stop, to consider the consequences of their actions, and that was the victory. The second officer, still standing by the side of the car, finally spoke up. Sorry about that, ma'am," he said, his voice lacking confidence. His eyes were avoiding hers now, almost like he couldn't bear to look at her directly. Maya didn't respond to him. She didn't feel the need to acknowledge him any longer. He had already proven that he wasn't worth her time. The first officer, sensing the tension in the air, nodded to the second officer. "Let's go," he said quietly, as if he just wanted to leave as quickly as possible. The second officer, hesitated for a moment, but then followed the first officer back to their cars. Maya watched them walk away, their footsteps echoing in the quiet evening. As they climbed into their vehicles, the officer's earlier bravado was gone. They weren't in control anymore, and they knew it. Maya stood there for a moment longer, letting the weight of the situation sink in. She wasn't sure what had just happened, but she knew one thing for certain. She had stood up for herself, and it had worked. It was a small victory, but it was hers. And that victory felt empowering in a way she hadn't expected. With the officers now back in their patrol cars, the sound of their engines starting up broke the stillness. Maya watched as they drove off, their taillights fading into the distance. She took a deep breath, trying to steady herself after the encounter. Her heart was still racing, but it wasn't from fear. It was from the adrenaline of standing up to power, of taking control of a situation that could have easily spiraled out of her hands. As she got back into her car, Maya felt a strange sense of relief wash over her. She wasn't scared anymore. She wasn't angry. She was proud. Proud of how she had handled herself. Proud of how she had turned the situation around without losing her cool. It wasn't easy, and it wasn't something that could be done every day. But tonight, Maya had reminded herself that no matter what anyone tried to do, she was never going to let anyone take her dignity again. As she pulled away from the scene, she thought about the other people out there, those who didn't have the same strength, the same control. Maya knew there were many who faced similar situations every day, who couldn't turn things around as easily as she had. This experience was a reminder to her of the importance of standing up, of speaking out, and of being aware of the power that each person had within themselves. It was a lesson, not just for her, but for anyone who felt powerless in a moment of injustice. Maya had learned something tonight, and that lesson would stay with her forever. This expanded part 3 captures Maya's internal reflection on the power shift and her calm, strategic handling of the situation. It delves deeper into her thoughts about her strength, the consequences for the officers, and the quiet victory she achieves. Let me know if you'd like to continue expanding or adjust the story. As Maya drove away from the scene, the events of the past few minutes replayed in her mind. She couldn't quite shake the feeling that something significant had just happened, but at the same time, she wasn't entirely sure what that something was. There had been no huge confrontation, no grand speeches or dramatic moments. It wasn't a movie scene. It was real life. It was quiet, tense and subtle, but it was enough to leave her with a sense of unease and accomplishment all at once. Her hands gripped the steering wheel as she navigated the city streets, the familiar route home now feeling unfamiliar, as if the world had shifted just a little. The adrenaline that had rushed through her body when she said the words, "I work for the FBI," still pulsed through her veins. Maya could feel her heart rate slow, but she was still processing everything. The way the officers had frozen when she spoke, the way their confidence faltered, replaced by uncertainty and fear. It was as if she had broken their sense of control with one simple statement, one simple sentence. Maya's mind wandered to her years of experience. Growing up, she had always known that the world saw her differently. She had always felt the sting of discrimination, the subtle and not so subtle ways people would treat her differently because of the color of her skin. From a young age, she had learned to navigate spaces that weren't always kind to people who looked like her. Whether it was the look she got at the store or the way her teachers sometimes treated her in school, Maya had learned to read the signs, to know when something wasn't right, and to respond in a way that didn't give away her vulnerability. But this was different. She wasn't in a store or a classroom. She wasn't surrounded by classmates or strangers in a public place. This was the police, the people who were supposed to protect her, the people who, in theory, were there to keep the peace. And yet, here they were, treating her with disrespect, treating her like she was nothing more than an object of ridicule. They had pulled her over for a minor infraction that didn't even exist and then tried to humiliate her in front of the whole world. Maya had faced racism before. She had faced moments where people tried to undermine her because of her race. But this was different. It wasn't just some random individual making a comment. It wasn't a microaggression. It wasn't even a situation where the person had power over her in a way that couldn't be challenged. This time, it was two police officers who thought they could get away with something simply because they had the badge and the uniform. They had treated her like she didn't matter, like she wasn't even human. But in that moment, Maya had made a choice. She had chosen to stand up. She had chosen to say something. It wasn't a loud protest or a dramatic confrontation. It was quiet. It was strategic. It was powerful. The simple words, "I work for the FBI," had shaken the officers, and for the first time in a long while, Maya felt that power flowing through her. She realized that it wasn't about using force or shouting to make a point. It was about knowing when to use your voice, when to speak, and when to stand firm. As Maya neared her apartment, she felt the tension begin to ease. The weight in her chest, the nervousness that had plagued her earlier, was starting to lift. But there was still something gnawing at her. She wasn't sure what to make of the encounter. What did it all mean? Was this just another random instance of racism, something she would eventually shake off and move on from? Or was this a sign of something bigger, something that had to be addressed? Maya pulled into her parking spot and cut the engine, sitting in the car for a few more moments. She wasn't in any rush to get out. The world outside seemed so normal, so unchanged, but Maya felt like she had stepped out of one world and into another. She wasn't the same person she had been before the traffic stop. She wasn't even sure what she was supposed to feel. Her phone buzzed in her pocket, interrupting her thoughts. It was a text from her friend, Jamila. "How's your evening? Going?" Maya smiled and quickly typed out a response, wanting to share what had happened but unsure how to put it into words. She thought for a moment before texting back. "I had a weird encounter with some cops tonight. Got pulled over for no reason and things got a little tense." She paused and read her message over before hitting send. She didn't want to go into too much detail just yet, not until she could make sense of what had happened. The phone buzzed again and Jamila's response popped up. "What happened? Are you okay?" Maya leaned back in her seat, thinking about how best to explain it. She didn't want to make it sound like it was just a regular traffic stop. She didn't want to downplay the way she had been treated, but she also didn't want to dwell too much on the negativity. She typed slowly, then hit send. "I'm okay. They pulled me over for a taillight issue that didn't exist, and then one of the officers, he tried to make a joke and tugged on my skirt. I didn't let them get away with it, though." Her phone vibrated again almost instantly. "What did you do?" Maya smiled, feeling a sense of pride as she typed out her reply. "I just said I work for the FBI. They panicked. It was kind of wild." She could almost hear Jamila laughing on the other end of the phone. "Girl, you didn't. That's brilliant." Maya chuckled softly to herself. She had to admit even now there was a sense of satisfaction in her response. It had worked. She hadn't let them push her around, hadn't let them belittle her. In that moment, she had taken back control. The conversation shifted after that. Jamila wanted to know more about the details, and Maya told her the story, but she couldn't help but feel a little distant. The more she talked about it, the more she realized how far-reaching the incident had been. She wasn't just recounting a story to a friend. She was starting to piece together the weight of what had happened. Maya hung up the phone after a while, but her mind still buzzed with thoughts. She knew that the encounter wasn't over, that it wasn't something she could just brush aside. She had faced racism before, but this time it had felt different. It had felt personal. It wasn't just about what the officers had done to her. It was about the system that allowed this kind of behavior to happen over and over again. It was about the countless others who had faced similar treatment and didn't have the means or the power to fight back. Maya knew that she couldn't just let this go. She couldn't let the officers get away with it. She had to make sure that what had happened wasn't forgotten. It wasn't just about seeking justice for herself. It was about making sure that something changed, that other people wouldn't have to go through what she had. That night, as Maya lay in bed, the weight of the world settled around her. She wasn't sure exactly what would happen next, but she knew that this was just the beginning. She had made a statement, and now it was time to figure out how to make sure her voice was heard. This expanded Part 4 delves deeper into Maya's thoughts and reflections after the incident, highlighting her internal journey, her empowerment, and the realization that this experience was part of a larger issue. It also touches on her support network and how she's processing the event. Let me know if you'd like to continue or adjust the story. The days following the incident felt like a blur to Maya. It was strange the way the world could feel both normal and altered at the same time. She went about her daily routine, work, grocery shopping, meeting friends, but each moment felt somehow heavier, as if the weight of what had happened was always just beneath the surface, waiting to come up again. She couldn't stop thinking about it, and she knew she wouldn't be able to forget. As the week passed, Maya found herself reflecting more on what had happened during the traffic stop. At first, she had just been glad to walk away without further incident. But now, the more she thought about it, the more she realized that the moment had shifted something deep within her. It wasn't just the officers who had been shaken that night. Maya had been shaken too, but in a different way. The way they had tried to belittle her had left a scar, but it had also lit a fire inside of her. She couldn't let it go. It wasn't about them. It was about everything they represented. The system that made people like her feel small. The structures that allowed this kind of behavior to continue unchecked. Maya knew that her reaction to the situation had made an impact, but now it was time to figure out how to make that impact matter. She had been given a glimpse of her own power in that moment, and she wasn't going to waste it. What had started as a small act of self-defense had now grown into a larger mission. To not only speak out for herself, but for others who might not have the chance to stand up in the same way. It wasn't just about confronting the officers or seeking justice for herself. Maya realized that this was part of a bigger conversation about race, power, and accountability. She started researching how to report incidents like the one she had faced. She contacted a local civil rights organization, sharing her story and asking for advice. They were supportive and encouraged her to file a formal complaint, not only about the treatment she had endured, but also about the larger issue of police misconduct. The process of filing a formal complaint felt strange at first. Maya had never done something like that before. It was hard to put her feelings into words, to distill everything she had experienced into a few pages of text. But as she wrote, she realized how important it was. She wasn't just recounting the events of one night. She was adding her voice to a larger movement, one that sought to hold people in power accountable for their actions, to make sure that incidents like hers weren't swept under the rug. The complaint took time to file, and the whole process felt like an uphill battle. But Maya pushed through. She spent hours researching the law, learning about her rights, and getting the guidance she needed to ensure that her complaint would be taken seriously. In the back of her mind, she knew that this might not lead to immediate change, but it was a step. It was something that she could do to make sure that what had happened to her didn't happen to someone else. One afternoon, as Maya sat at her desk, reviewing the documents she had prepared for her complaint, she received a call. It was from Jamila. Her friend's voice was warm and concerned, as it always was, but there was something else in her tone this time. Something urgent. "Hey, Maya," Jamila said. "Have you been following the news?" Maya leaned back in her chair, furrowing her brow. "What's going on?" "There's been a major incident downtown. Another case of police misconduct," Jamila replied, her voice quiet but filled with emotion. "It's all over the news." Maya's heart sank as she listened to Jamila recount the details. It was another instance of police officers using their authority to harass a black person. Maya didn't know the full story yet, but she could already feel the familiar ache rising in her chest. This was exactly what she had feared. The system that allowed her incident to happen was still in place, still operating without accountability. Maya's stomach twisted and she felt the weight of the injustice settle into her bones. "I can't believe this is happening again," Maya said, her voice thick with frustration. "It just feels like nothing changes." Jamila's response was quiet but determined. "It won't change if we don't keep speaking up. You're already doing something, Maya. You've already made a difference." Maya took a deep breath, trying to calm the storm inside her. She knew Jamila was right. This wasn't just about her. It was about something bigger. The world wasn't going to change overnight, but every voice mattered. Every action counted. "I'm going to finish what I started," Maya said, her voice firm. "I'm filing this complaint, and I'm going to keep fighting. We have to keep fighting." That conversation became a turning point for Maya. She realized that she wasn't alone in this fight. There were others like her, people who had faced the same struggles, people who had been treated unjustly, and together they could make their voices heard. As the weeks passed, Maya's confidence grew. She continued to work on her complaint, refining it until she felt it was strong enough to send. But she didn't stop there. She began talking to others in her community, sharing her story, and encouraging them to speak up when they saw injustice. She knew that one complaint, one voice might not bring about immediate change, but a movement, those could change the world. The response she received from the civil rights organization was encouraging. They praised her for her bravery and offered to help her move forward with the process. They also offered guidance on how to speak out and raise awareness about issues like hers. Maya felt a renewed sense of purpose. She was no longer just a victim of an unfair situation. She was part of a larger force that was pushing for change, for accountability, and for justice. Maya's journey was far from over. The path to justice was long and there were many obstacles ahead, but she had already taken the first step, and with each step she grew stronger, more confident, and more determined to make sure that what had happened to her would not be forgotten. She filed her complaint and received acknowledgement that it had been processed. It was a small victory, but it was a victory nonetheless. Maya knew that it wouldn't be easy, and it might not lead to immediate consequences for the officers involved. But she also knew that this was just the beginning. Change didn't come quickly, but every small action was a part of the greater movement. She had learned that standing up for yourself was powerful, but standing up for others, that was what really made a difference. In the weeks that followed, Maya found herself speaking at local community meetings, joining rallies, and becoming an advocate for change. She had been inspired by her own experience to help others find their voices too. The same fire that had burned inside her when she faced the officers that night continued to drive her forward. She wasn't done yet. She wasn't just going to sit back and let things continue as they were. As she looked out at the faces in the crowd, Maya knew that she had started something important. This wasn't just about one incident. It was about a movement for justice, one that was bigger than her, bigger than the officers who had tried to humiliate her. This was about people coming together to fight for equality, fairness, and respect. And with every step, every voice that joined the fight, Maya knew that they were getting closer to a future where no one would have to face what she had faced again. This final part of the story highlights Maya's growth, from the initial incident to becoming an advocate for change. It shows her determination to take action and continue the fight for justice, as well as the support and strength she finds in community. Let me know if you'd like to adjust any part of it or continue exploring more of her journey.